July 1944. Behind the dense hedgerows of Normandy, a thin column of wood smoke rises into the morning sky. A German supply unit is attempting a basic task, boiling rations to feed the exhausted infantrymen holding the frontline trenches. Before the food can be loaded into transport thermoses, the air tears open. Within minutes, a heavy American artillery barrage strikes the exact coordinate of that smoke, obliterating the kitchen and the surrounding staging area. In a landscape saturated with high explosives, the simple act of preparing a hot meal had become a death sentence. How did a basic cooking fire become a fatal tactical vulnerability? That strike was not an isolated incident, nor was it a stroke of random luck by a bored artillery forward observer. That across the Normandy front in the summer of 1944, from the flooded marshlands of Carentan to the claustrophobic bocage surrounding Saint-Lô, the targeted destruction of German supply points became a deliberate, highly systematic Allied strategy. American and British spotter planes, along with ground-level infantry observers, were explicitly trained to hunt for the faint, telltale signatures of human survival. They were not merely looking for armored columns or hidden anti-tank batteries. They were actively scanning the horizon to exploit the daily feeding rituals of the enemy. This dynamic exposed a brutal collision between the biological realities of warfare and the unforgiving mathematical geometry of modern artillery grids. The soldiers simply cannot fight, hold ground, or endure the psychological terror of continuous combat without caloric energy and a hot meal. Armies fundamentally run on food. But in a theater of operations where the Allied forces possessed near-total air supremacy and overwhelming rapid-fire artillery dominance, absolute invisibility was the only true guarantee of survival. Every emission, every sound, and every thin wisp of smoke rising above the hedgerows served as a beacon, immediately calling down concentrated high explosives. This creates a fascinating yet grim historical puzzle. How exactly did the basic, non-combat necessity of boiling soup and brewing a morning cup of ersatz coffee transform into one of the Wehrmacht's most fatal tactical vulnerabilities? The answer goes far beyond simple carelessness or a lack of camouflage discipline on the part of the frontline troops. To understand why German infantrymen were consistently trapped in this lethal dilemma, we must first look at the very foundation of military logistics. We have to examine how these two opposing armies fundamentally viewed the concept of sustaining a frontline soldier in a mechanized war. To the German High Command, the answer to keeping a soldier fed and functioning was steeped in a rigid, deeply traditional military philosophy that predated the First World War. It revolved almost entirely around a single, massive piece of mobile equipment, the Große Feldküche, universally nicknamed by the frontline troops as the Gulaschkanonen, or the goulash cannon. This was not a small, modular stove or a lightweight field accessory. It was a heavy, wheeled, limber-drawn vehicle constructed of steel, cast iron, and copper. The standard models, the HF-11 and HF-13, weighed well over 1,000 kilograms when fully loaded. They featured a central, double-walled boiling cauldron with a capacity of roughly 200 liters, surrounded by smaller, secondary compartments designed for roasting meats or brewing large batches of substitute coffee. A tall, highly distinctive metal smokestack was folded down horizontally for transport and locked into an upright position during operation to draft the fire. Crucially, this entire system was fiercely centralized. German military doctrine dictated that one field kitchen was responsible for feeding an entire infantry company, which consisted of roughly 150 to 200 men. The Feldkoch, the designated company cook, was a vital, respected, and highly protected figure within the unit, reigning over his mobile domain with a dedicated staff of assistants. But the logistics required to keep this single piece of equipment functioning were immense and inherently fragile. Because the vast majority of the German army was not motorized, relying heavily on horsepower right up until the end of the war, these massive kitchens were typically drawn by teams of 2 to 4 heavy draft horses. They inherently required predictable, navigable road networks to move from sector to sector. More importantly, to bring 200 liters of water, potatoes, and meat to a rolling boil, the internal firebox required a massive, continuous intake of solid fuel. They burned bulk cordwood, or heavy coal. Creating the daily Eintopf, the traditional thick German field stew, demanded anywhere from 2 to 3 hours of steady, roaring, open flame. Tactically, this meant the kitchen could absolutely not be placed in the forward trenches. It had to be positioned in the rear echelon, usually 1 to 3 miles behind the active fighting positions, ideally hidden in a farmyard courtyard, a ravine, or a dense grove of trees. Once the meal was finally cooked, it had to be physically transported to the men enduring the artillery fire at the front. This introduced yet another severe logistical bottleneck. The boiling stew and hot coffee were transferred into heavy, insulated metal backpacks called Essenholer, designated ration details. Exhausted infantrymen temporarily pulled from their fighting holes had to hike back to the kitchen's location, load these awkward, sloshing thermal canisters onto their backs, and carefully navigate their way back to the front-line trenches on foot. Because daytime movement near the front was exceptionally dangerous, this rationing run typically happened under the cover of darkness, either late at night or in the very early, freezing hours of dawn. The German philosophy prioritized culinary comfort and psychological unit cohesion. A hot, freshly cooked meal, ladled out by the company cook from a central source, was considered paramount for maintaining the fighting spirit of the men. But it possessed a fatal, systemic flaw. It was a 19th century model of mass supply attempting to operate in a mid-20th century mechanized war. It tethered the survival and combat effectiveness of an entire company to a single, easily identifiable geographic point, a rigidly fixed daily schedule, and the continuous, unavoidable combustion of solid fuel. If the draft horses were killed, the kitchen stopped moving. If the dirt road was cut by a crater, the kitchen was trapped. And if the Gulaschkanonen itself was destroyed, 150 frontline soldiers instantly went hungry. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States military had taken a radically different, distinctly industrialized approach to the exact same problem. In the late 1930s, anticipating a global war of unprecedented speed and mobility, American quartermaster planners realized that relying exclusively on centralized field kitchens to feed rapidly advancing infantry or paratroopers was a recipe for logistical paralysis. They tasked the Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago with a groundbreaking and incredibly difficult mandate. They needed to engineer self-contained, shelf-stable, individual combat rations. The goal was to compress the daily caloric requirements of a heavily burdened frontline soldier into a waterproof modular package that could withstand freezing cold, searing heat, the damp holds of cargo ships, and the violent shock of a parachute drop. The result was a decentralized feeding system built on the back of American mass canning and packaging technology. The most famous iterations to emerge from this effort were the C-Ration and the K-Ration. The C-Ration, officially standardized in 1938, provided an individual soldier with 6 heavy tin cans per day. 3 were M units, containing a dense meat and vegetable component, such as meat and beans or meat and vegetable hash. The other 3 were B units, containing hard biscuits, soluble coffee, sugar, and hard candy. The K-Ration, originally requested by airborne commanders and designed with the help of physiologist Ansel Keys, was even more highly compressed. It consisted of 3 wax-dipped, heavily weather-resistant cardboard boxes labeled breakfast, dinner, and supper. These compact boxes packed processed cheese, canned pork, aggressively hard biscuits, bouillon powder, a chocolate bar, and even toilet paper and cigarettes into a lightweight unit that could easily slide into the cargo pocket of a uniform. It is absolutely crucial to note that these American rations were not culinary triumphs. In fact, American combat troops widely and loudly despised them. The sheer repetitiveness of the meals, the metallic taste of the canned hash, and the notoriously unappetizing chopped pork and egg yolk generated endless, bitter complaints. They caused severe digestive fatigue and routinely dragged down morale. No soldier sitting in a wet foxhole ever eagerly anticipated opening a cold tin of C-Ration stew. But while they were universally mocked for their taste, their tactical utility was utterly unparalleled. The quartermasters had ruthlessly prioritized caloric density, chemical stability, and individual autonomy over culinary comfort. A squad of 12 American infantrymen could be dropped into a ditch, handed a wooden crate of K-rations, and survive for 3 days without a single supply truck, horse cart, or field kitchen ever reaching their isolated position. This created a profound asymmetry on the battlefield. The American combat soldier was, in effect, a decentralized logistical unit. If he wanted to heat his canned coffee or warm his hash, he did not need to build a roaring wood fire. He could use a tiny chemical heat tab, such as trioxane, or a small, folding Coleman stove, creating a localized, nearly invisible, completely smokeless blue flame right at the bottom of his foxhole. If one American supply truck was destroyed by enemy fire, only that specific shipment was lost. The rest of the company simply opened another tin from their canvas backpacks and kept fighting. The conflict between these two armies was, therefore, not merely a clash of rifles and tanks, but a fundamental collision of logistical philosophies. On one side stood a rigid, centralized system demanding predictable road networks, vulnerable horse-drawn limbers, bulk firewood, and massive open-air cauldrons to sustain its men. On the other stood a highly modular, industrialized system of individual survival, backed by the largest commercial canning and packaging infrastructure on the planet. In a theoretical staff college exercise, the traditional German model might have seemed vastly superior for maintaining long-term troop morale, offering familiar, hot food over cold, processed tins. But military doctrine is merely theory until it is tested by the uncompromising, violent friction of geography. As the summer of 1944 approached, these two radically different methods of sustaining human life were about to deploy into the claustrophobic, unforgiving terrain of northern France. And in that specific environment, the traditional German reliance on centralized cooking was about to fatally collide with reality. The moment the Wehrmacht dug into the bocage of Normandy in June 1944, their centralized 19th-century logistical philosophy collided with a terrifying new reality: absolute Allied mastery of the sky. Above the dense, ancient hedgerows, the airspace was constantly patrolled by swarms of American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Hawker Typhoons, heavily armed aircraft the German troops universally dreaded as jabos, or fighter bombers. But an even more insidious threat drifted lazily at 3,000 feet. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper. It was a flimsy, fabric-covered civilian airplane, completely unarmed and maxing out at barely 85 miles per hour. Yet, to the German infantrymen, the appearance of this tiny, olive-drab aircraft was paralyzing. The Grasshopper carried an artillery observer equipped with a two-way radio. If that observer spotted a target, a coordinated barrage from massed 105mm and 155mm howitzers would impact the coordinates in under 3 minutes. In this environment, any daytime movement on the Norman road network became suicidal. This aerial panopticon immediately broke the fundamental rhythm of the German supply chain. The massive Gulaschkanonen, requiring 2 to 3 hours of burning heavy cordwood to boil its 200 liters of stew, suddenly became the most dangerous piece of equipment in a battalion's rear echelon. Wood smoke does not dissipate quickly. It rises in a highly visible, thick gray column, hanging above the dense canopy of the apple orchards. To an American observer miles away, a cooking fire was a geometric exactitude. It was a giant, unmistakable arrow pointing directly to a concentration of enemy troops, draft horses, and soft-skinned vehicles. The reaction from the German High Command was immediate and draconian. Regimental commanders issued strict, uncompromising orders: absolutely no open fires, no boiling, and no operation of the field kitchens during daylight hours. The visual signature was simply too lethal. Suddenly, the prized focal point of German morale was paralyzed. For the frontline infantrymen, pinned down in a muddy trench under constant harassment, this operational freeze was devastating. The traditional German system had no real contingency for a cold front. Unlike the American paratrooper who could crack open a K-ration, the German soldier relied entirely on what the centralized kitchen brought him. Deprived of the daily hot Eintopf, troops were forced to survive on whatever cold, coagulated remnants were left over from the previous night, or gnaw on Kommissbrot, hard, dense, dark rye bread, and canned meat that quickly spoiled in the summer heat. Starvation and sheer caloric deficit began to rapidly erode combat effectiveness. The pressure of this deprivation created a fatal temptation. Exhausted, watching their comrades wither under the physical and psychological toll of continuous combat, a company cook or a frustrated supply officer would inevitably take a calculated risk. They would find a deep ravine or an abandoned stone barn, assume the tree canopy was thick enough, and strike a match. They would try to heat just enough water for substitute coffee or warm up a stagnant batch of stew, hoping a small, quick fire would go unnoticed against the low-hanging, overcast clouds. It almost never worked. Allied aerial reconnaissance and ground spotters were explicitly trained to scan for these exact anomalies. The moment that thin wisp of wood smoke cleared the treetops, the response was mathematically ruthless. Within minutes, the low roar of Pratt & Whitney radial engines would echo across the valley as a flight of thunderbolts rolled into a steep dive, or the sky would suddenly tear open with the shrieking incoming rush of a time-on-target artillery barrage. The blast waves would shatter the cast-iron cauldrons, kill the vital draft horses, and eliminate the highly trained cooking staff. In the brutal calculus of the Normandy battlefield, attempting to provide the basic human comfort of a hot meal during the day was no longer just an infraction of camouflage discipline. It was a self-imposed death sentence. The Wehrmacht was trapped by its own equipment. The centralized kitchen could not be abandoned, but it could no longer exist under the sun. To keep the infantry from starving, the entire massive, cumbersome machinery of German field logistics had to fundamentally mutate. If daytime cooking meant immediate destruction, the kitchens had only one option left. They had to be pushed into the dark. By forcing the kitchens to operate exclusively under the cover of darkness, the German High Command triggered a cascade of logistical nightmares that fundamentally altered the daily rhythm of the frontline soldier. The immediate consequence was geographical. To ensure that the massive, horse-drawn Gulaschkanonen were entirely out of visual range from American ground spotters and safely insulated from the immediate blast radius of frontline mortars, regimental commanders ordered the kitchens pushed significantly further into the rear echelon. Before the invasion, a company kitchen might sit comfortably a mile behind the main line of resistance. Now, in the claustrophobic nightmare of the Norman bocage, they were dragged 3, 4, or even 5 miles back. They were hidden deep inside the courtyards of abandoned French stone farms, camouflaged under the thickest canopies of ancient apple orchards, or tucked into steep, wooded ravines where the dense summer foliage could absorb both the physical profile of the wagons and the noise of the draft horses. But in warfare, safety for the rear echelon almost always translates to increased suffering for the frontline infantry. By pulling the central source of food miles away from the combat zone, the German military violently stretched the physical tether between the cook and the soldier to its breaking point. The task of bridging that miles-long gap fell to the Essenträger, the designated ration details. This was not a specialized logistical unit. These were regular infantrymen, exhausted, dirty, and traumatized by continuous daytime combat, who were pulled from their fighting holes at nightfall and ordered to walk into the dark. The physical mechanics of this operation revolved around a specific piece of equipment, the Essenholer 39. This was a heavy, double-walled thermal canister designed to be worn on the back like a rucksack. Constructed of aluminum or enameled steel, it featured a clamp-down lid and a capacity of roughly 12 liters of hot liquid. When fully loaded with dense potato stew or ersatz coffee, a single canister weighed nearly 30 pounds. Because the company was starving, a single soldier on the ration detail was often forced to strap one canister to his back, carry a second one by its metal handle, and drape heavy canvas bags filled with dense, dark Kommissbrot, military bread, around his neck, all while keeping his Mauser rifle slung over his shoulder in case of a firefight. Weighed down by 50 to 70 pounds of awkward, sloshing liquid and bulk carbohydrates. These men then had to navigate the most treacherous terrain in Western Europe in pitch blackness. The Norman Bocage was not a standard battlefield. It was a prehistoric labyrinth. The terrain was defined by massive earthen embankments, choked with thick roots and dense briars, separated by deep, sunken dirt lanes known as chemin creux. During the day, these lanes were death traps zeroed in by machine guns. At night, they became disorienting, muddy tunnels. The German ration parties had to hike 3 to 5 miles through this maze without the aid of flashlights or vehicle headlights, often reduced to holding the canvas webbing of the man directly in front of them to avoid getting lost in the identical-looking hedgerows. The journey was agonizingly slow, incredibly noisy, and highly dangerous. The metal Essenholer canisters clanked against each other, and the sloshing of the liquid echoed in the quiet night air, making the ration details prime targets for aggressive American night patrols infiltrating the lines. But the most lethal threat to the Essenträger was not the American infantrymen. It was the mathematical ruthlessness of American artillery. The United States Army in 1944 possessed a seemingly infinite supply of high-explosive shells, and they did not stop firing when the sun went down. Throughout the night, American batteries engaged in a relentless doctrine known as harassing and interdiction, or H&I fire. Fire direction centers would pre-plot the coordinates of every major crossroad, bridge, sunken lane intersection, and tree line behind the German positions. At completely random intervals throughout the night, batteries of 105mm and 155mm howitzers would suddenly unleash a volley onto these exact map coordinates. The objective was not necessarily to destroy specific targets, but to paralyze the enemy's logistical network, deny them sleep, and kill anyone attempting to move supplies under the cover of darkness. The German ration details, forced to use the road networks and sunken lanes to carry their heavy loads, walked directly into this mathematical meat grinder. The friction this created at the front line was catastrophic. A ration party would leave the trench at midnight, expecting to return by 3 in the morning. By 4 in the morning, the men in the foxholes would still be waiting. By dawn, they realized the food was not coming. Perhaps the ration detail had simply gotten lost in the maze of hedgerows, wandering for hours in the wrong direction. Perhaps they had tripped a mine in the dark, or, most commonly, they had been caught in a sudden random barrage of American H&I fire at a crossroad 2 miles away, their blood mixing with the spilled, ruined stew in the mud of a Norman lane. The psychological toll of this failure was immense. The frontline German soldier, having survived another day of dive bombers and tank assaults, found himself shivering in a damp hole, his stomach entirely empty, knowing that the only food intended for him had been destroyed in transit. Days would pass. Units would go 48, sometimes 72 hours without a single hot meal, forced to gnaw on moldy bread and scavenge from the packs of their dead comrades. The centralized 19th century kitchen model was proving fundamentally incapable of bridging the final 3 miles of a 20th century battlefield. And yet, despite the horrific casualties among the ration details and the agonizing hunger at the front, the kitchens still had to cook. The sheer caloric demand of the Wehrmacht demanded that the Gulaschkanonen operate. To avoid the daytime fighter bombers, the cooks attempted to adjust their schedules to the very edges of the day, firing up the massive cauldrons in the late twilight of dusk or the freezing gray hours just before dawn. It was a desperate compromise, hoping that the low light would shield them from the aircraft while still allowing the ration details a modicum of visibility to carry the food forward. But this tactical shift played directly into the hands of a different, far more analytical predator. Across the lines, American forward observers had quickly learned to exploit the biological rhythms of the German army. These were highly trained artillery spotters positioned in the bell towers of ruined stone churches, hiding in the attics of Norman farmhouses, or sitting in the cramped, freezing cockpits of Piper Cub spotter planes circling miles away. They did not just stare randomly at the horizon. They hunted with specific, calculated intent. They knew that human beings required food, and they knew that the German logistical system required fire. At dawn and dusk, the American spotters would raise their high-powered M3 binoculars and battery commander telescopes, scanning the dense green canopy of the bocage for a very specific meteorological anomaly. In the early morning, the air over Normandy is typically cold, damp, and heavy. This creates an atmospheric condition known as an inversion layer. When a German cook, hidden deep in a ravine miles away, struck a match and ignited the heavy cordwood inside the firebox of the field kitchen, the resulting wood smoke did not immediately dissipate into the sky. The cold morning air trapped the smoke, forcing it to spread out and hang low just above the apple orchards, creating a distinct, flat, blue-gray haze against the dark green foliage before eventually rising in a thin, undeniable column. To an American observer staring through coated optics, that wisp of smoke was not merely a sign of life. It was an exact, highly visible geometric coordinate on a topographical map. The moment the smoke was sighted, a chillingly efficient sequence of events was set into motion. The observer would calculate the distance and azimuth using his compass and map, key the handset of his SCR-300 field radio, and transmit a fire mission back to the Fire Direction Center. But the resulting artillery strike was rarely a single harassing shot, and this reveals the most devastating consequence of the German cooking fires. By the middle of the Normandy campaign, American military intelligence and senior artillery commanders had thoroughly dissected German field doctrine. They understood the inflexible rules of the Wehrmacht's centralized logistics. A Gulaschkanone was never deployed in isolation. Because it was designed to feed an entire company of up to 200 men, and because it required a dedicated staff, draft horses, and a constant supply of bulk rations, the presence of a kitchen guaranteed the presence of a major troop concentration. More importantly, American G2 intelligence analysts realized that German battalion commanders, seeking to maintain tight control over their logistical lifelines, almost always positioned their command posts in close proximity to the field kitchens. Furthermore, the surrounding woods or farmyards where the kitchen was hidden served as the natural staging areas for reserve infantry units preparing for imminent counterattacks. The Americans realized that they were not just looking at a cook boiling potatoes, they were looking at the exposed, beating heart of a German battalion. The simple, domestic act of lighting a cooking fire transformed the kitchen from a low-level supply unit into a high-value, strategic intelligence target. The smoke was the X that marked the location of the enemy's nervous system. Consequently, when the American Fire Direction Center received the coordinates for a suspected kitchen, they did not respond with a light mortar barrage. They brought down the hammer of God. The FDC would coordinate multiple batteries of heavy 155mm guns, calculating the exact flight times of the shells so that they would all detonate on the target at the exact same fraction of a second. A devastating tactic known as time on target. For the German cooks and the officers in the nearby command post, there was no warning whistle, no escalating ranging shots, and no time to dive into a slit trench. The morning silence was simply shattered by a synchronized, cataclysmic explosion that instantly vaporized the kitchen, slaughtered the draft horses, decimated the command staff, and shattered the reserve infantry units resting in the surrounding woods. By aiming precisely at the stomach of the German army, the American artillery was systematically decapitating its local leadership and neutralizing its counterattack reserves before they could even reach the front line. The psychological terror of this realization paralyzed the German rear echelon. The officers fully understood that the very act of trying to feed their starving men was bringing total annihilation down upon their own headquarters. In a desperate bid to survive, regimental commands issued even more draconian orders. Cooking was pushed entirely into the absolute dead of night. No fires at dawn, no fires at dusk. The cauldrons could only be lit under the cover of the blackest hours, with thick tarpaulins strung up in the trees to hide any stray sparks from the chimneys. The cooks worked in near total blindness, terrified of making a sound, knowing that the slightest emission of light or smoke could trigger a time-on-target barrage. The German army was attempting to hide its biological necessity in the deepest shadows of the bocage. But despite the grueling night marches, the strict blackout discipline, and the desperate attempts to outmaneuver the American observers, the German logistical system was fundamentally doomed, because even in the pitch black of midnight, they were fighting a losing battle against the physics of the very fuel they were burning. The ultimate betrayal of the German logistical system was not the design of the field kitchen itself, but what it was forced to consume. In a mechanized, industrialized war, the chemical properties of fuel dictate survival on the battlefield. The American quartermaster network, for all its culinary faults, supplied its battalion mess tents with M1937 field ranges powered by pressurized, atomized gasoline. These units burned with a clean, highly efficient, and nearly invisible blue flame. For the individual American infantryman, tiny chemical heat tablets provided completely smokeless combustion at the bottom of a foxhole. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, had largely exhausted its ability to deliver clean-burning processed coal or specialized smokeless briquettes to the Normandy front. The French railway network had been systematically dismantled by Allied heavy bombers, and whatever trucks remained were prioritized for hauling ammunition, not cooking fuel. To feed the massive fireboxes of the field kitchens, German cooks were forced to rely entirely on what they could chop down and scavenge from the immediate environment. They had to forage in the Norman bocage, but the summer of 1944 in northern France was notoriously wet, plagued by persistent rain squalls and heavy morning dew. The wood they stripped from the ancient apple orchards and dense hedgerows was green, damp, and thoroughly saturated with moisture. This created an unsolvable problem rooted in basic chemistry. When freshly cut, wet timber is exposed to high heat, the thermal energy is initially consumed by boiling away the trapped water, rather than cleanly combusting the cellular structure of the wood dust. This incomplete combustion generates a massive volume of unburned carbon particles and vaporized resins. It does not produce a hot, clean fire. It produces an immense, choking, and highly volatile column of thick white smoke. No amount of military discipline, strict blackout orders, or tactical camouflage could alter the chemical reality of combusting wet wood. Even if a field kitchen was pushed 3 miles behind the front, hidden in a deep ravine, and operated exclusively at 2 in the morning, its physical footprint was impossible to erase. The distinct, acrid smell of burning green timber drifted for miles on the night wind, alerting aggressive Allied infantry patrols and night fighters to the exact location of the rear echelon. Worse, the dense smoke generated in the dark did not simply vanish. Trapped by the heavy, humid night air of the French coast, the smoke would pool and linger in the low-lying valleys, clinging to the dense tree canopy like an unnatural, localized fog. When the sun finally rose and the American spotter planes returned to the sky, that stagnant pool of gray haze acted as a lingering fingerprint, pointing artillery observers directly to the exact courtyard where the cooks had been working just hours before. The German logistical apparatus was fundamentally trapped by its own technological limitations. They were fighting a modern, highly industrialized enemy with a system that required the open burning of foraged timber, functioning much like an army from a previous century. The beloved field kitchen had become a massive, stationary liability. And as the static trench battles of June and July finally began to fracture, giving way to a chaotic war of rapid mechanized movement, a supply system tethered to centralized fires, wet wood, and slow-moving draft horses was hurtling toward an inevitable, catastrophic collapse. In early August 1944, the agonizingly slow War of the Hedgerows suddenly ruptured. Following the American armored breakout during Operation Cobra, the static front lines dissolved into a frantic, chaotic race toward a rapidly shrinking escape corridor near the town of Falaise. For the retreating Wehrmacht, this sudden shift from entrenched defense to a high-speed daylight withdrawal was a logistical death sentence. The rigid, centralized umbilical cord between the frontline infantry and their rear echelon field kitchens was violently and permanently severed. The heavy, horse-drawn Gulaschkanonen simply could not move fast enough to survive. The narrow dirt roads of the Falaise pocket quickly became a concentrated graveyard of German transport. Thousands of retreating vehicles, supply carts, and heavy horse teams were tightly packed bumper to bumper, crawling at a walking pace. Above them, swarms of Allied Typhoons and Thunderbolts strafed the congested columns hour after hour, turning the retreat into a localized inferno. In the panic, the massive iron kitchens were abandoned, flipped into ditches, or blasted into twisted scrap metal. The company cooks, once the protected morale builders of the unit, became just another group of desperate infantrymen running for their lives. For the German soldiers still fighting desperate rearguard actions, the loss of the kitchens triggered an immediate systemic collapse of combat cohesion. They had no industrialized, shelf-stable combat rations to fall back on. When the Essenholer ration details stopped arriving in the dark, the men had absolutely nothing. Within 48 hours of the retreat beginning, tens of thousands of trapped German troops were reduced to a state of primal starvation. The highly disciplined soldiers of the Wehrmacht were forced to scavenge like feral animals. They dug frantically in the Norman dirt for raw potatoes and unripe turnips, chewing them unwashed while hiding in ditches from passing Allied armor. The darkest irony of this logistical disintegration was the fate of the horses. The massive draft animals that had pulled the Gulaschkanonen across Europe now became the army's final, desperate food source. As artillery shrapnel and aerial rockets continuously decimated the transport columns, starving German infantrymen would swarm the freshly killed horses. Driven by sheer caloric deficit, they hastily carved slabs of raw meat from the carcasses right on the side of the road. They attempted to roast it over tiny, hidden fires, terrified that the smoke would draw yet another artillery strike. The very biological engines of their 19th century supply system became their final rations. For the advancing American, British, and Canadian forces closing the pocket, the wreckage of this logistical network became the definitive marker of their tactical success. Allied infantrymen cautiously moving down the Dives River Valley did not just find knocked-out Panther tanks or abandoned anti-tank guns. They walked through miles of shattered field kitchens. They discovered massive iron cauldrons upended in the mud, still half filled with rotting cabbage and charred horse meat. To an American GI, marching past these ruined kitchens with a couple of waterproof K-Rations tucked neatly into his canvas webbing, the sight was surreal. It was undeniable, physical proof that the enemy's nervous system had completely failed. The smoldering wreckage choking the roads of Falaise represented far more than just the destruction of a single army group. It was the physical manifestation of a doctrinal collapse. The traditional philosophy of war had been broken by the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of the 20th century, leaving a lesson scattered across the French countryside. The shattered iron cauldrons rusting in the ditches of the Falaise pocket were not simply the casualties of a retreating army. They were the physical wreckage of an obsolete military philosophy. The systematic destruction of the German field kitchens perfectly illustrates the fatal friction that occurs when rigid, deeply traditional doctrines collide with the unforgiving velocity of mid-20th century total war. The Wehrmacht had attempted to fight a mechanized, three-dimensional conflict while tethered to a 19th century logistical anchor. They prioritized the psychological and physical comfort of a hot, centrally prepared meal, failing to recognize that in an era of total aerial supremacy and mathematically precise artillery, that comfort had evolved into a lethal liability. By contrast, the American infantryman marching past those ruined kitchens carried the crude but effective solution to that exact problem right in his canvas webbing: the individual combat ration. It is vital to remember that the C-Rations and K-Rations were practically despised by the men who had to eat them. They were cold, monotonous, they routinely tasted of the tin they were packed in, and they offered absolutely zero culinary comfort. But in the brutal calculus of the Normandy hedgerows, taste was completely irrelevant. The American quartermasters had engineered a triumph of flexible, industrialized warfare. By compressing a soldier's daily caloric needs into shelf-stable, modular packaging, they effectively severed the highly vulnerable umbilical cord between the frontline rifleman and the rear echelon. An American squad could vanish into a wet trench, open a wax-dipped cardboard box, and consume the calories necessary to continue fighting without ever needing to build a fire. They never had to draw a map coordinate in the sky with a column of trapped wood smoke. They remained completely decentralized, hidden, and functional. This logistical asymmetry reveals a profound truth about the mechanics of modern combat. It does not matter how deeply an infantryman digs his foxhole, how perfectly he weaves local foliage into his helmet net, or how strictly his officers enforce noise discipline in the dark. The finest operational camouflage in the world is rendered entirely useless if the massive logistical tail required to sustain his biological existence acts as a highly visible, unavoidable beacon. The German army in France was fundamentally betrayed by its own physiological need to eat. The simple, inescapable human requirement for calories and warmth was efficiently transformed into the mechanism of their destruction. This underlying reality forces us to look past the conventional narratives of tactics and armor and reconsider the true, exhausting nature of the battlefield. A landscape where the machinery designed to sustain human life became the very instrument that summoned its sudden end. In the deadly hedgerows of Normandy, a hot meal became a luxury that the Wehrmacht simply could not afford if they wanted to survive. The massive iron kitchens, designed to nourish and comfort a generation of infantrymen, ultimately became their executioners. This was the unforgiving reality of a new industrialized era of warfare, where the sky was no longer a canopy, but a weaponized grid. The American GI, shivering in a flooded foxhole while forcing down a cold tin of processed hash, survived precisely because his misery remained invisible. The German soldier, starving in the dark for a ration detail that would never arrive, was fundamentally betrayed by an obsolete system. It is a stark, definitive lesson etched into the cratered soil of northern France. In the brutal, mathematically precise arena of modern combat, the army that has to build a fire is the army that burns.